Now I would like to summarize what we've learned, as I see it, in top 10 lessons about landscape fragmentation and about restoring landscape connectivity. So the first one is there are thresholds in the cumulative effects of landscape fragmentation and habitat loss on the viability of wildlife populations. However, we don't know where these thresholds are, or we know very little where they are. So we have to take that into account, that we know very little about them. Second, many wildlife populations have long response times to landscape fragmentation. Therefore, landscapes have an extinction debt. That means if today you look at a landscape and you find quite a bit of biodiversity in this landscape, this does not mean that this biodiversity is able to stay, because these extinction times are often about decades. So here are a few examples. When you build the new roads here, the wildlife populations will be affected by all these processes we've talked about, and it will take quite a long time, several generations usually, until it will reach its new equilibrium where either extinction risk is higher or maybe it will even go down to zero. So this is from Richard Foreman's book about road ecology. And again, we have the problem that we know very little about these extinction times and also about the extinction debt. One paper that was about plants estimated that between 17 and 70% of plant species would be lost. So that's a huge range, high uncertainty about these estimates. In this paper by Tillman et al., we find the statements that the more fragmented a habitat already is, the greater is the number of extinctions caused by added destruction. Such extinctions occur generations after fragmentation, and therefore they represent a debt and a future ecological cost of current habitat destruction. Another example by Findlay and Bourdage in their paper, Response Time of Wetlands Biodiversity to Road Construction on Adjacent Lands. They state, our results provide evidence that the full effects of road construction on wetland biodiversity may be undetectable in some taxa for decades. Such lags in response to change and anthropogenic stress have important implications for land use planning and environmental impact assessment. This information about these response times you will never find in any environmental impact assessment today. So that's a huge problem. However, if you want to see the world in a more positive way, you can say, well, maybe this is an opportunity. This means that if certain biodiversity is still around and it takes a few decades until it disappears, that gives us time to improve the quality of our landscapes to save the biodiversity before it's gone. So we can take this as an opportunity. It's time given to us to do something about the quality of the landscape while biodiversity is still there. Lesson 3. Explicit consideration should be given to the remaining uncertainties in decision-making, and the precautionary principle should be applied. You will find descriptions of the precautionary principle in many places, not only in Europe. This is an example from Canada, from the Privy Council Office, where they state the absence of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing decisions where there is a risk of serious or irreversible harm. Lesson 4. Monitoring of landscape fragmentation as a threat to biodiversity is relevant as a pressure indicator. So you do not want to only monitor biodiversity itself, but you also want to include in biodiversity monitoring the threats that are increasing. And this is particularly important when you consider the response times. Because the information about biodiversity itself doesn't give you an indication how much biodiversity is already scheduled to be lost over the next 20, 30 years. The need for indicators has been stated over the last 15 years a lot. Here are a few examples from Europe, from the United States, and from Canada. Because we already know today that landscape fragmentation is a serious threat to the sustainability of human land use, to biodiversity, and to many ecosystem functions and services. even if we don't not fully understand all the mechanisms. This is an example from Switzerland, the biodiversity monitoring system, which has been in place for about 10 years now. It uses various indicators in 3 groups, and landscape fragmentation is one of these indicators under the pressure indicators, and it uses the effective mesh size. Lesson 5. Maintaining a network of ecological corridors is less costly than paying for their restoration later. There are 2 striking examples, Switzerland and the Netherlands, where they have been are in the process still of putting millions and millions of Swiss francs and euros into the restoration of their network of ecological corridors. For countries where there still is not yet as much sprawl and fragmentation by roads, this is an opportunity to protect these corridors so they are protected right from the beginning instead of having to put so much money into the restoration. This is the example from Switzerland, the corridor system of national importance. Only 28% of the corridors are still intact today. More than 50% are disturbed, and 16% are disconnected. So Switzerland is putting a lot of money into the restoration of all these places where motorways are dissecting the wildlife corridors. Another example is done in Switzerland. They're in the process of putting 400 million euros into the defragmentation of the Netherlands. So this is money you could save. Lesson 6. The monitoring of the use of wildlife passages should be complemented by variables that tell us about the viability of the populations. This is a general problem that often ministries of transportation, when they put wildlife passages here and here, for example, and they monitor the use, this does not tell them whether the population is viable and made viable again by these wildlife passages. Maybe road mortality is still going on if the road is not fenced, and you may invest money in these connections, but you may not know if the population is viable. So that is an additional thing to consider for monitoring the success of mitigation measures. Lesson 7, the use of Baki design, which is the before-after control impact design, should be considered for studying the effects of roads and also for the effects of mitigation measures. So this means that you want to compare 4 situations. You have the before situation of building a road. So here you have landscapes over time without the road and then with the road. This would be the impacted site, or several ones here are 2 shown for replication. And these would be the control sites. And then you can compare the behavior of the impacted site. So this is the measurement endpoint, for example, population size. And then it would probably go down at the impacted site. And you can then compare that with the control site. Today, often monitoring is only done after the road is in place. So I just got a project funded by the Ministry of Transportation in Quebec, but the road is already built and the wildlife passages. So we have no before data, and that weakens the conclusions, what you can infer from the study. You can do this also for mitigation measures. So here you have a road in the landscape, and then you put crossing structures. So you actually have 3 phases, before, during, and after, and that would give you a BDACI design, or BDACI design, to study the effects of mitigation. And then you get 3 curves that you can compare, where you use one landscape without a road and without mitigation measures as one control site, to see if the impacted and mitigated site will do as well as the control site. And a second control is the unmitigated roads. And here you would expect that the impacted site first would show the same effects as the landscape with road, which is not mitigated, and then the mitigation would improve the situation that it would be comparable to the control site. That's the landscape without a road. Lesson 8, limits to control landscape fragmentation should be considered. We have so many limits for air quality, for water quality, and many other things. Why not have limits to landscape structural changes? This may sound a bit unusual to start, but when you think about it, it makes quite a bit of sense. And actually, the declaration was made by the German federal government already in 1985 that they have the goal to reverse the trend in land consumption and landscape fragmentation. And also in Germany, there is a general intention in planning to preserve large unfragmented spaces with little traffic, which is a central principle of regional planning and landscape planning so far. However, this is the theory. In fact, landscape fragmentation has increased quite a bit in Germany as well. So recently, the German Environmental Agency has put out the proposal to establish limits to landscape fragmentation. Well, this is a start. This is just a proposal first to slow down the speed of increase in landscape fragmentation. So the idea is, when you look at the values from 2002, the idea is if, for example, the value is less than 10 square kilometers, the reduction over the next 13 years since 2002 should be less than 1.9%. And here the values are a little adjusted depending on the effective mesh size. So it really limits or slows down the increase of landscape fragmentation. But you could go a step further and can say, in this region, we do not want the effective mesh size ever to be less than, say, 20 square kilometers. Lesson 9, there is a need to care about the quality of the entire landscape, not just about protected areas or the wildlife corridors, because animals don't know where the protected area ends or where the corridor is. They will move around everywhere. And test lesson 10, protecting enough habitat is important. If you just focus on wildlife corridors and still continue with losing habitat, that will not be enough. As a conclusion, I think it's worth trying to avoid repetition of mistakes that other countries have made. And Switzerland and the Netherlands really provide excellent examples to learn from their experiences. Because for those mistakes that they have done in the past, they have to pay quite a bit right now. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to give more information.